This video is rated B for you'd better back on out of here if you don't want spoilers, buddy. Good day, my friends, and welcome back to our series of lessons on the overarching history of Hydaelyn. By now, you understand where history as we know it began, and how we even reached this point in the first place. If you've not had the chance to partake of those lessons, I'd recommend doing so as we pick up from where we left off. For today, we resume discussing the ravages of the Sixth Umbral Calamity, the Calamity of Water. Like stated in the previous lesson, the Calamity of Water was brought on by the excessive use of black and white magic. These spell schools thoroughly drained the land of Aether, putting the world horribly off balance. This was the moment the Ascians had been waiting for since they had coaxed the 10th shard towards the element of water, initiating the rejoining and sealing the fate of not only the people of the source, but every life upon the 10th shard as well. There was no stopping what had begun as the oceans began to swell and the world began to drown beneath rising waters and unforgiving storms. Many different civilizations attempted many different methods of survival, but the most common was the use of higher ground. Areas with lower elevation were all but abandoned for the safety of higher mountains and plateaus. The Lalafell of Nim that didn't leave their country during Project Maelstrom used the island's volcano to escape the waters. Most people living in Eorzea retreated north to the mountain range of Ablathia's Spine or the Girabonian Highlands. However, as horrible as the calamity was, it would have been so much worse if it weren't for a select few called the 12 Archons. These individuals were clever people that had predicted the calamity and made preparations against it. They had spread out and warned many people what was coming, and some even built vessels to try and safely carry people across the water. One of those Archons was a Rogadin named Nyunkref, who enchanted an ark and saved as many lives as possible. He would eventually lead the people he saved to a new land off of Eorzea's western coast, where they would settle and eventually create the country known as Old Sharlayan. Such was the power and foresight of these Archons, and without their aid, the Calamity of Water would have been so much worse. Now, before I continue, know that the Sixth Astral Era wasn't all that long ago. As such, most of, if not all of this era's history has been recorded in great detail. Detail that I cannot cover in one lesson alone. To that end, I will cover the Sixth Astral Era in broad strokes here, but know that if you wish to learn the finer details of the city-states, magical and technological advancements, and the many heroes born out of this era, I've already begun to discuss those things in previous lessons. Things like Old Sharlayan, Limsa, and even Garlemald have already been given their due diligence. So if you wish to learn about the finer details of something else in this era, let me know after the lecture. But now let us return. Even as the waters of the calamity began to subside, there was no hope for most city-states to go back to the way things were. The city of Mach was now a festering swamp riddled with uncontrolled void scent. Meanwhile, the elementals living within the Black Shroud saw what the arrogance of Amdapor had wrought and made the forest grow outward, engulfing the dead city-state before casting a glamour over it, hiding the ruins of Amdapor from their former residents and the world. But from here, the world was able to begin again, and many people thought that with the last elemental calamity over and done, that their trials were over, and the world was free to become a living paradise. As you all experienced, this was far from the truth, but they didn't know that yet. All they understood was that as the floods of the calamity ended, the Sixth Astral Era had officially begun. The first 400 years of this era were called the Years of Restoration. This is a time when many civilizations that survived the calamity tried to recover, and people of those city-states that didn't make it tried to pick up what few pieces of their lives they had left. However, this was also a time of great prejudice. Like the Fourth Astral Era, knowledge and excessive use of magic was seen as the root of all evil. Entire libraries that housed tomes of arcane lore and practices were put to the torch, while mages were hunted down and put on trial for their craft. However, the strongest mages still inspired fear in the hearts of the meek, so while few dared to approach them, they were never welcome in whatever developing tribes or towns there were. A few things worthy of note during this time was the founding of Old Sharlayan by Njunkref and his survivors, the Great Hyr Migration, and the eventual founding of Ishgard. Old Sharlayan was one such nation that didn't shun magic like the rest of the world, and instead decided to learn from the mistakes of the past and use their spells responsibly. After the floodwaters receded, the Elezen attempted to move back into central Eorzea, but were overwhelmed by the amount of Hyr that were suddenly all over the land. Due to racial conflict, the Elezen collected their things and began to move north, some settling in camps around the Black Shroud, while another massive group moved further north. Eventually, these Elezen reached Dravania and began to make peace with the dragons there. They settled their lands and eventually established the nation of Ishgard. Not long after, the dragon Hraesvelgr devoured his beloved Saint Shiva, solidifying their peace and promoting 200 years of practical paradise between the Elezen and dragons. The years 400 to 1000 were called the Age of Communion. While the first great migration of Hyr to Eorzea saw the Elezen move and spread across northern Aldenard, even more Hyr began to migrate to Eorzea in the following centuries. This sudden shift in population density brought the racial tension between Hyr and other races to a boiling point, with many fights breaking out between tribes and budding nations. But the Hyr expanding everywhere across Eorzea wasn't the only thing happening at this time. In the year 432, Old Sharlayan named its first archons, who in turn created the Studium and had grown into a proper society driven forward by education, research, and exploration. Unfortunately, the year 545 was when King Thordan I and his Knights 12 betrayed and murdered the dragon Ratatoskr, resulting in Nidhogg killing innocent Elezen in droves, and thus beginning the Dragon Song War. The early 600s was when Old Sharlayan successfully recreated the Aethernet, allowing for the reemergence of teleportation magics across their islands. The early 700s was when Hyr started to migrate to where the Elezen had settled around the Black Shroud. Getting pushed around by Hyr settlers again caused a great deal of fighting between the two races. Around this time is when the Lalafell, who were descendants of Mok, traveled south and eventually began to settle the harsh terrain of Hydaelyn. Soon after, they created the new nation of Belladia. The mid-700s was when the Elezen and Hyr in the Black Shroud finally settled their differences and created the underground nation of Gelmora to escape the wrath of the elementals. It was about this time that a Hyr warlord tried to invade the Lalafell's new land in Hydaelyn, but he was decimated by the forces of Belladia and his tribe was scattered. In the 800s, most pure-blooded Garleans had been forced to move up into northern Ilsabard, beginning their long exile from warmer climates. Afterwards, the ship known as the Galadian landed on the Isle of Vilbrand, eventually leading to the creation of Limsa. In the early 900s, Belladia and Old Sharlayan began talks about sharing knowledge, with Belladia eventually gaining their own aetherite crystals, finally giving Sharlayan researchers the chance to teleport directly to Eorzea. However, in the mid-900s, civil war broke out in Belladia over twin princes fighting over the throne. This eventually led to the end of Belladia, but the creation of Ul'dah and Sil'Dih. Old Sharlayan chose to remove themselves during this civil war, which was wise since the aetherite crystals were eventually destroyed in order to prevent surprise attacks. That brings us to the years 1000 to the 1300s. Known as the Years of Strife, this was a time full of growing pains for the new nations that were rapidly developing into what we know them as today. The Ixal that had been allowed to live in the Black Shroud were eventually cast out by the elementals for damaging the forest beyond repair, forcing the majority of their race to relocate to Xelphatol. In the year 1076, after decades of failed attempts, a Hero mage from Gelmora named Joran Lightheart successfully communed with and spoke to the elementals. Joran and the elementals reached a peaceful agreement, and the people of Gelmora are finally given sanctuary by the spirits of the forest. This led to the construction of Quarrymill, and eventually, the city-state of Gridania. However, Joran's wife would bear him a son with 2 distinct bumps on his head. These growths eventually developed into horns, and he took the name Iahok Pota, becoming the first Pajal and eventually the first Elder Seed Seer as the nation of Gridania continued to grow in the safety of the Black Shroud. In the year 1135, a Highlander hero named Anshelm Katar began subjugating and unifying the tribes in Giribania, eventually leading to the creation of the city-state Ala-Mhigo. In the year 1181, Ul'dah created an alchemical potion called the Traitor's Spurn that had the power to reanimate the dead. This was the edge they finally used to overthrow their sister nation of Sildi, leaving Ul'dah as the dominant city-state in Thanalin. Shortly after, Ul'dah begins trade negotiations with Limsa Lominsa to start trading goods to the Near East via the ocean. This crippled Ala-Mhigo's economy, since their position as gateway to Eorzea was now circumvented, and trade within their nation has begun to slow to a crawl. The centuries between the 1300s and the 1500s were called the Age of Stability. This was when the city-states as we know them had finally finished establishing their borders, and were tired of the constant fighting. Instead, they began to open up trade to one another, and begin an age of peaceful development. However, during this time, many organizations were worried that open interaction with other nations might alter their way of life. To prevent this from happening too drastically, many guilds began to emerge as a way of safeguarding their nation's traditions and skill sets. In the year 1311, a research team from Old Sharlayan moved to the Dravanian hinterlands. This research settlement eventually became an extension of their nation and would simply be referred to as Sharlayan. In the year 1353, Iahok Pota, the first Pajal and Seed Seer, peacefully passes away mid-meditation at the age of 272. With no signs of sickness or poor health, it's assumed he died of old age. Around that time, Ul'dah hired mercenaries from Ala-Mhigo to help purge the undead coming from the ruins of Sildi. However, things took a turn in the year 1468 when Ala-Mhigo began launching surprise attacks on Gridania's East Shroud. King Manfred, the current ruler of Ala-Mhigo, believed that conquest was the only way to reignite his country's economy. But, with the help of the elementals, Gridania didn't roll over as easily as they thought. This was known as the Autumn War, but 1 year later, the combined forces of Gridania, Limsa, Ul'dah, and Ishgard devastated Ala-Mhigo's army, ending the Autumn War and forcing Ala-Mhigo into full retreat. This ruined the good faith they'd built with the other city-states of Eorzea, making the Autumn War one of the major reasons why none of them rushed to Ala-Mhigo's aid during the Garlean invasion. That brings us to the 1500s, which is the time period that would mark the end of the Sixth Astral Era. It was in this time that Garlemald would see rapid magitech development and military expansion thanks to the efforts of Solus Galvus, who was actually the Ascian Emmet Selk in disguise. Since I've already covered this piece of Garlean history, as well as their years of conquest, I'll close this lesson on the fact that the 1570s would mark the end of the Sixth Astral Era. This would be the stage of the Seventh Umbral Calamity, as Dalamud was brought down and the Elder Primal Bahamut was allowed to rampage through Eorzea, bringing the entire continent of Aldenard to its knees. It was only thanks to the sacrifice of the Sharlayan Archon Louisoix that Bahamut's rampage didn't devastate the entire world like every other calamity before it. Bahamut was prepared to unleash an attack that would have obliterated Eorzea, the aftermath of which would have devastated the entire world. But Louisoix interrupted it, dealing Bahamut a lethal blow in the process. Because of this, the bulk of the calamity was localized around Eorzea, leaving the rest of the world largely unscathed when compared to previous calamities. This marks the Seventh Umbral Calamity as the shortest calamity, eventually giving way to the Seventh Astral Era. But just because Louisoix interrupted the calamity doesn't mean a rejoining didn't happen. Indeed, the Seventh Shard was lost during this event, as its energies and souls rushed to rejoin the source. This sudden wave of Aether is what made Bahamut so much stronger than he already was, as he absorbed much of that power to thoroughly destroy the world. This was also the first calamity that wasn't associated with one of the 6 elements. However, because of the hyperactivity of Aether at the time, and the rapid changing of etheric crystals, we can reasonably assume this calamity was astrally charged. That would suggest that if there were an 8th calamity, it would have been umbrally charged. In other words, a calamity built on stasis, or the lack of change. But that's just a theory I've collected from reliable sources. Currently, we now live in the dawn of the 7th Astral Era. The world is 7 times rejoined, and the societies of the 6th Era are free to continue moving forward. I personally feel that since all of you lived through the 7th Umbral Calamity, that I suggest you think on what that means. Many people didn't make it out of Bahamut's rampage alive, and your continued existence should teach you something. For the sake of those that aren't with us anymore, hear my honest suggestion. Go forth and speak to your fellow neighbors. Tell them what you learned from these lessons, this collection of history. This might inspire hope in them, as it has many others. Together, we can all wish for a better future and even begin to craft it with our own hands. As for me, I will continue to roam, in search of more stories to bring you. So, till next time, be well, my friends, and sleep well. Hello everyone! Thanks for staying to the end of the lesson. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, subscribe and like this video to let me know I'm doing well. If there is a topic you'd want me to cover in the future, leave a comment about it and I'll see what I can do. Until next we meet, I'll be researching even more of our world's rich lore to share with you. Till then, stay safe, my friends.